Welcome to Edmonds Radio. We are back with Danny LaMartina with the Bro and the Brain. Danny, welcome. I'm excited. We get to
I'm
talk about
excited.
training. Yeah, yeah. I always joke that most people just ask me about shoulder training or legs, and what's really comical is probably chest is a body part that I struggle with really, really early on in my life with bodybuilding because I did not connect to it. I didn't feel it. I was good at pressing, but that did not correlate to any progress in terms of muscle gaining. I didn't look like I could press what I did, I guess would probably be the better way to say.
Yeah.
Let me start off by just saying this was a listener question, and the guy asked, he said, "Hey, can you just give me all things chest training?" And he just wanted to hear you and I ramble on about it. So let's start here. Logically, when you hear someone say chest training, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Pressing.
Yes, same. Yes. For me, incline pressing specifically, but yes, pressing. So you came from a powerlifting background. Was strength on the bench press something you had naturally? Did it come quickly, or was that something you had to work on?
That was definitely something I had to work on. And it's something that, like, having worked mostly with men now too, and a lot of men transitioning from powerlifting to bodybuilding,
Yes.
what you said about basically being able to press a lot more than you look like you should be able to is super, super, super common, right? And so I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about with regards to development and strength, because in my mind, in my opinion, I'd love to know what's worked for you. But just to me is a little bit like back to where you got to finesse like the session structure a little bit to where, yeah, you need a couple of like heavy overload movements, but throwing in like a stretch movement and then going into another press, like session structure, I think is probably one of the biggest difference makers for people who come from a strength background, in my opinion. But what
1,000.
was that like for you? I mean, what was like the thing that for you? Because your chest is, I think, one of your strong points right now.
So yeah, it's
Emily?
yeah, it's that's something that I really care about, right? Because when I started bodybuilding, like everyone talked about how what's your bench press? And that is something again that I was strong at, but it didn't look like I could press jack shit. And I
Yeah.
believe it's because I came from a football background where it was be good at the flat bench and it's how much weight you could ram off your chest from A to B. And I didn't at that time of my life when I was playing football, I didn't think about I wanted my chest to grow, but it wasn't like a focal point. It was like how many times
Yeah.
225, press it off, and then what's your one rep max, right? And that translated when I got into bodybuilding is I was very good at pressing for considering how light I was. And I always thought in my mind, like very naively, that the bigger my bench press was, the bigger it would be. And some of the best advice I ever got from the guy who taught me bodybuilding, he said, "Chris, get off that fucking flat bench and go do incline barbell and incline dumbbell." And I said, okay, like I trusted him. Like I believed in him so much. And I said, okay, that's if that's the secret, then I'm going to do it. And so what I did was I went from just to give you guys some raw numbers, I was able at that time to press 225 off my chest for 28 reps. I could easily handle 315, but I got on the incline and it was like 165 felt heavy as hell.
Yeah.
And I was like, no. So
No,
it was
I get that.
yeah, it was
You know,
like, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
coming from the powerlifting background, every time I put someone on an incline, and myself included, I was like, oh wow, I went from feeling like I'm pretty strong to like, better start the bar.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really interesting when you feel like you're really good at something and then you get humbled. I just viewed it as motivation. I was like, you know what? Screw this. I'm going to get that back to where that's not an issue anymore. And if he's telling me that growth is going to like align with that, even better. It's a double win. So
Yeah.
that was the first thing that I would say triggered a lot of chest growth initially. The next thing is the first 2 years I ever worked with John is he removed all flying from my programs for chest. And I tell people this all the time. The first 2 years I worked with him, I did two total fly movements ever. Not two times a day or two times a chest day, two flies, eight total sets the entire 2 years.
Why was that?
Because he told me that if I pressed, my chest would grow. And he said, you looks like someone who, if you spent the next 2 years focusing on not only the weight that you pressed, but making the connection with your chest through pressing, that
Yeah.
it'll work. And I said, you know me, like I'm a good listener.
Yeah.
When it comes to people I respect. So I said, okay, cool. Well, when I got to him, my incline barbell was like 245 for six at week one. After 2 years, that was at 365 for eight. On dumbbells before him, I was pressing the 120s. After those 2 years, I was pressing the 150s with relative ease, like for a good set of 8 or 10. So I try to tell people that, like, I know that a lot of really smart people will tell you to fly, but if you're young, that's something he impressed upon me a lot was, hey, get good at pressing. And we did lots of dumbbells, lots of barbell, and hammer strength machines, and it just worked. And stretch push-ups. That was something else that we did. Honestly, that's how
Yeah.
he programmed the stretching movement for me. Excuse me, was the stretch push-up. So if you know if you're out there listening and you're like, oh my God, am I just pressing? Well, yes, you can still achieve a stretch with a good dumbbell or a stretch push-up. So that's honestly kind of where mine began to see significant improvement. And then I think as the years went on, like with any body part that I've developed, the bigger it gets, the easier it becomes to connect to it. And then I just needed time, effort, and energy and to repeat. Uh,
Yeah.
and something else I try to really share with people is from all that flat benching early on, I was very middle pec to lower pec dominant. And
Yeah.
anytime he would write a press in there, on especially on pump days, I'd make it all incline.
Hmm.
So yeah, that I would say it was beyond huge for me.
Well, I mean, a lot of that makes sense in a lot of ways, and I'm trying to deconstruct this in my brain in terms of biomechanically, what do we need for good chest movements, right?
Right, yes, please.
We need, some good mobility at the shoulder, but the other thing that we need is the ability to have the upper rib cage actually like move and expand a little bit. And different types of rib cage shapes just naturally are going to respond better to that than others. So you and I are polar opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is what's cool about these conversations, right? Is that like we talk about two very different case studies.
Yes,
Um, so your upper rib cage might not expand uh, for one reason, and mine might not expand for another. And we could go into that could be a whole conversation in and of itself.
right.
Second to that, if we're going to try and bias a different incline angle, like do we want a low incline? Do we want a mid incline? Do we want a steep incline? Beyond just the biomechanics of looking at development, each of those positions of incline is going to demand a different degree of humeral internal rotation at the bottom and a relative external rotation at the top. And I'm not saying externally rotated, I'm saying relative to the internal position at the bottom. Coming back to neutral is basically a greater state of ER. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Mhm.
So those are two kind of primary considerations I look at when it comes to chest training. Now, personally, one of the reasons I love a stretch movement for people is because it allows the upper rib cage to lift and to move the way that it does. I think we talked about this with people who like in their front relax, they go to pose and you're like, why can you not just get your delts out? And it's because that upper rib cage can't lift. We
Yes,
talked about that, right? Was that with you?
yes. In person.
Um,
Sure.
yeah. Um, So that needs to happen, but especially if you're coming from a different strength background, whether it's like, in the weight room, in a sports team, or if you're coming from powerlifting, the reason I love the stretch movement is that you're going to open up some different fascial lines that need to be used. And if you want full pec development, more and more of like I'm going to talk about the difference between like the red stuff and the white stuff. And the red stuff is like muscle, right? And the white
Yeah.
stuff is more like fascia, connective tissue, tendon, ligament, all that kind of stuff. We think about that as very passive and not having a lot of input in terms of like how we move, but it's incredibly important. You could think about that as the packaging that surrounds the meat. And if that can't move, you're not going to get the full expansion of the red stuff.
Yes.
So just from like the biomechanics, we want to think about how do we open up as much of that as possible? And what degrees of rotation? Um, we think horizontal abduction, but that's really IR at the bottom. So that's kind of where my brain is right now. But that's where, like, when I think about structuring a program for someone, if they're more advanced, I love the press fly combo,
Same.
which I think is kind of where you're at too.
Yes. Agreed.
But
Yeah.
for a lot of my guys who are transitioning, I'm a little bit like, I think what it sounds like John did with you, to where it's like, man, like we got to get you really used to pressing, but with a different intent. Now,
Correct.
I'm
Yeah.
one where I think pressing depth becomes really important. And I'm
Okay.
gonna,
Yeah.
with the same caveat that I give always, is that more is not better. I think a lot of people end up kind of jacking up their shoulders by trying to take a press too deep. And there are two reasons why that's going to happen. For someone like you or Dave, you're really good at relying on that connective tissue, kind of the white stuff. So you might get to the bottom and kind of dip below.
Right.
That takes tension off the muscle and kind of reloads connective tissue, which you don't love.
Yes.
Me, because of my rib cage shape, and you can see it on all of my pressing movements. Like if you look at my dumbbell pressing,
Mm,
this is all kind of depressed down. For me to get any deeper, where's that going to come from? It's not my chest. It's going to be my shoulder dumping forward.
correct. Yeah.
So even like on my Smith pressing, like I have to be very cognizant on, how much, where in the motion is the range actually coming from where we want it to. Um, so that's
Okay.
kind of my just general like spew of all the things.
You're transitioning right where I wanted you to. And that is finding I don't know if this is the right word, but to me, it's called what I will always review as like the active range of motion for chest, right? And what I really mean by active is where is the weight always on your chest and it stays there, not transition to shoulders, not transition to triceps or joint, as you just said, right? So,
Mhm.
like you said, if I'm talking about me specifically, if I get past here, no go. If I
Mhm.
get past here, that's a no go.
Mhm. Yeah, 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 yeah.
So I've always thought chest and quads are very similar to me. I don't want the extreme ends. I want all that middle meat.
This is literally what I was just telling Dave on his hack
Yes.
squat on Saturday. I was like, if this is your total range of motion, this is full lockout, this is full bottom, you literally need to go here and stay in
Yes.
this.
Yep.
Um,
Agreed.
and he's been miserable with it, which is great. But but I think chest pressing is the same way. And
Yes.
one of the things that, especially if you're someone who deals with elbow issues,
Right.
like what are the big problems that keep people from progressing their chest is usually some sort of pain or instability, right? And if you really want to take care of your elbows, avoiding that full end range lockout is probably one of the best like pieces of low hanging fruit. A lot of times people come to me and I give them that and they're like, I don't hurt anymore. And I'm like, well, I guess you don't need me anymore. Cool, go lift some weights.
You know, I really hate banging on these dudes, but like I really challenge people to think intelligently. That RPE strength app is like really pushing people to go to extreme ends of range of motion. Like they'll take one of those, I don't even know what they're called, like the bent bar to where your chest can sink in between
Yeah,
it
yeah, yeah. That.
and get into that. And I'm always like, not everyone can do that, bro. Like not everyone needs that extra 3 inches. And just because you can get it there doesn't mean it's productive. Um, and they're selling it to people is if you can get to that range of motion, it's going to protect your shoulder in the long run. And I actually think it's the opposite. I think it's going to give you less years of hard chest training as opposed to finding the range of motion that works best for you and where you feel connected to the muscle tissue where it doesn't leave the load off of the chest. And yeah, go ahead.
No,
It,
I agree with that. I think that, I mean, in general, I think that, yeah, if you're a novice trainee and you have no, bang ups and bruises from the years, you didn't play sports, you're basically coming in absolutely 100% fresh. Does
right.
that work?
Yeah.
Yeah. But how many people are actually like that?
Very little.
Not a single person that I've worked with in the last 10 years, 12 years.
Right.
I do think that, again, if I'm going to nerd a little bit, some people are structurally put together in a way where they can do that. And
Correct. Yes.
Dr. Mike is put together in a way where he can do that. Jared is put together in a way where he can do that. Now, of course, it's no surprise that people who train together and like use the same types of movements generally look kind of similar structurally, like anthropometrically, right? If you look at like the overall shape of the rib cage, if you look at how the scaps sit on the rib cage, if you look at clavicular width, it's just something that people don't talk about. If you want to find a good chest press movement for you, when was the last time you actually thought about how wide your clavicles are?
Right.
Because that's going to be important in terms of your grip width and what's a good angle for you. But
Agreed. Yes.
we don't talk about that. Um, so I mean, like I get it, and I never want to like poo-poo another, methodology on the internet. But I do think it's really important to be able to keep the goal.
Mhm.
And what you've said a number of times now, and probably one of the biggest things that I learned when I started training with you was not just training the muscle, but keeping it on the muscle.
Correct.
And having the intent on every rep, on every set
Yep.
is much different. And that's a skill that takes a long time to develop. And I think people don't necessarily have the patience for that at times.
Right. That's the number one thing people report when they train to me, when they train with me in person. They're like, you stay on that muscle from the start to the finish. And I'm like, yeah, that's what I need out of you. And you have to
Mhm.
find that range for you. That took years for me to figure out. Like, everyone's like, oh, well, I think they just want to be told, right? Like, do this. And I'm like,
Yeah.
ugh, yeah, like, okay, cool. Like, if you can get to that range and it feels good on your chest, great. But what if you can't? And I always push back and I say, more is better unless it's not. And
Yeah.
when you hear that, it's like, well, of course, Chris, even a dummy would recognize that. But you don't apply that to your training? Like, come on, please, God. Like, I, the first time John ever told me, hey, Chris, on the incline barbell, stop the bar 2 to 3 inches above your chest. And my initial thought was, why would I do that? Like, I can get it there comfortably. And then I started doing it, and I'm like, oh my God, that's so much harder. And I get off of
Yeah.
my upper chest is sitting off my collarbone. I'm like, man, he's onto something there. And then the more I hung out with him, he's like, yeah, man, he's like, that's just to protect your shoulders. Like, there's no need to go those bottom 2 to 3 inches.
Mhm.
We're going to accomplish that on another exercise. And I'm like, oh man, a light bulb goes off. And I'm like, oh, instantly
Yeah.
in that moment, okay, cool. So you're telling me that every exercise doesn't have to be total range of motion, that we can train segments of the muscle throughout the entirety of the workout. Awesome. I just learned, and you opened my mind to a new principle that I'd never even considered. Right. And
Yeah.
I think with chest,
Mhm.
that's what I really challenge people to do is when you do your reps on, and it doesn't matter if it's a dumbbell, a barbell, a machine, if a certain range, either you lose tension on the chest or you feel it transition to the joint, you have to take a mental note of that. And then you have to do one or two things. Stop short of that happening, or you must address that structural issue that you may have, and that could be, hiring you, getting massage, working on range of motion or mobility, fill in the
I
blank.
think for most people, honestly, like if there's one thing that I would really love to point people to, it's he's hard to understand, but Bill Hartman really has done a lot to open up, how do we, unfortunately, no one's taking his stuff and bringing it into bodybuilding, which is kind of like where I'm like trying to go.
Okay.
But he's really done a lot to open up like why do certain people respond better to certain training styles? And I think upper body in particular is really important because when we think about how are you going to know if something doesn't feel good? Like what's going to be that point where you go, oh, that maybe I need to change something. Obviously, we think about shoulder pain, right?
Yeah, right.
But what else attaches to your collarbone? A lot of your neck muscles.
Right.
And so if you end up kind of locking up this upper trunk, if you get a lot of neck tension after, things like too much upper trap tension, if you end up getting just, I don't know, really tight, like through here, those are other kind of KPIs that maybe there's a different movement or pattern you need to be working in. And so I think chest training is one of those too, where because it's generally loaded heavy, my model of training that I use with people is generally that like we need to be able to understand and anticipate when whatever we're doing in training is paying too much of a training tax. And then how do we shift and pivot to redistribute the load and continue to grow? And I think that heavy chest training at times, everyone's going to have a different secondary or tertiary layer that adds to that. For me, it's my jaw and my neck. Like I know that I've taken my chest training too far when I'm like my jaw is going crazy and I'm getting headaches.
Right.
For other people, it's chronic shoulder stuff, elbow pain, and even a lot of forearm issues. So I think the reason that's important is that so we think about shoulder rotation up here,
Mhm.
but the proximal and distal humerus, there's a little bit of a bend on that bone that has to happen through that eccentric. And
Right.
so if you don't have the range of motion here is a lot of times where you're going to end up having the elbow issues. So
Yeah.
it's interesting what you mentioned about stopping 2 inches above your chest because one of my favorite movements I don't know that it does a lot for me, but when I was in prep for Chicago Pro in 2022, I was like 6 weeks out, and I think I was spoto pressing like 215 for sets of like 6 or 8. And I felt like that was that year, my chest stayed full, like
Right.
full, way more than 23. But it's the same concept where you're basically keeping tension on the muscle within a line that actually works for you. So,
You know, I think exercise selection is just something I'd like to touch on really quickly before I
Mhm.
really want to get into like scapula stuff with you. Um, so to give some hard examples, I know I've shared in the past, like on one of the episodes we did where I talked about how I hate the decline barbell. Like I can't stand it. John was a big fan early in a lot of his programs of doing decline Smith machine pressing. That never felt great to me. I'll be honest with you. Like I never liked it. And I did it because he wrote it, but I if you had like a gun to my head and said, how would you rate those? Like I would choose decline hammer strength, decline dumbbell press, and those are both on slight declines. None of all these are extreme, like slight declines. Nothing is extreme decline. And then I'd probably go Smith machine, then barbell if I'm rating those in order I feel it. Like if someone will say, Chris, like I want to attack those lower pecs, I'm going to say decline hammer strength or a decline dumbbell all day long. Um, where on incline barbell, or barbell, Smith machine, hammer strength, dumbbell, I feel that incredibly well. And it feels like just good for my body, right? Um, and then flies for the most part, I can do anyway. I don't like low cable crossovers. So that's a lot of like bicep and front delt for me. If I load it properly. But high cable crossovers, roller flies, pec deck, I've been in like this groove of doing like slight incline dumbbell flies that I love. And those feel great to me. I'm trying to think what else chest wise that I really do outside of everything I just laid out there. Like I like a dip. If I'm being honest with you, I don't know if that's just my love for Branch Warren.
Generationally, we should all have that.
Yeah, yes, yeah, yes.
I mean, if we're honest.
Right. Good God, like the amount of times I watch those MD videos of him doing chain dips and his chest is just massive. I'm like, okay, I got to figure out how to get good at these because I want to be like him. So, yeah,
Trying to think. So the tricky thing about chest training is like I don't want to get into scap mechanics and collarbone mechanics and all that too much, but I think what people need to realize is that there's so much more biomechanically going on than just like this. Um, and
let me ask you
some,
this. Do you think people think too much about that shit and not focus on pressing? Because I think if you ask me a question, I would think people are too concerned about like scapular retraction and they don't think about,
if people never retracted their scapulas again in their life, I'd be very happy.
okay,
We could
perfect.
stop just squeezing the crap out of our shoulder blades just because like 20 years ago that's what people told us to do. That would be great. Because that actually destabilizes the system. And without having any sort of posterior expansion through the rib cage, which you're not going to get if you're squeezing everything together, you can't stabilize. So kind of where I wanted to go with a lot of the rib cage stuff. One of these sessions or one of these podcasts, I should like pull up the app that I use and do a little 3D demo because it's so important what's happening up here in terms of like you live here, right? Of
Yeah,
course, you're going to be really good right in this angle. Am I? Probably not. And so being able to kind of have an appreciation for like why certain movements might feel good for chest training, I think is probably one of the most important concepts to understand because ultimately the more tension we have on superficial muscles, big muscles, chest, um, lats, rhomboids, traps, things like that, that is what drives our ability to manage pressure, which has way too many other secondary and tertiary effects on things like leg day, on back day. So the smarter we can be on something that's already kind of like a high training tax concept, the better we're going to be able to train all the other body parts. Does that make sense?
it does.
So, for example, if Dave does a ton of really, really wide pressing and he doesn't have the range for it, and he keeps trying to go super deep and jumps his head forward,
Right.
did you see what happened in my back there? My scap's basically just retracted. Like,
Right.
it, not without trying to, but just to take that deeper. The only place I have left to move from was here.
Is to row
So when
it.
you see people, yeah. So when you see people jutting their neck forward, you've basically said, okay, I've run out of room. Where can I create that space? Well, how about if I take my upper back and shove me forward? Now, if he's trying to grow his upper back and we're basically taking his body's neurological breaker box and we're taking that muscle and we're brightening that dimmer switch up again, is he going to be able to get chronic length on there when he's training it?
No.
No, because again, he's continuing to shove himself forward in space. And so I hope you kind of see these like trickle on effects. So when I'm sitting here and I'm like talking about, oh, the training test, blah, 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 I'm not being like PT who's like, don't train heavy. I'm saying you need to train freaking heavy to put the muscle on, but you have to be smart about your movement selection because there's going to be an output on the other side that you either do or you don't want. And sometimes we don't know until we make those mistakes, right? Like I didn't know that chest training jacked me up so bad until all of a sudden I started getting like wicked tinnitus for months on end um, from having way too much of this like high to low angle. For me, that's not a good angle. Um, and so if we think about positions, one quick thing that I would give people is like lie on your back, bring your arm out to the side, put your hand literally like right on the front of your shoulder. Check your rotation in, check your rotation out. The more here you are, the lower kind of like open angle, like a low to high fly, that's going to require external. You're not great at that. So of course you're going to get more front delt and bicep there. If you're more limited at internal, like I am, starting up high is probably already going to put you in a position of IR that you don't have, and your front delt's just going to take over for you. So one of the big things that I think people can look at is toying with hand position.
Okay.
And kind of knowing that even if maybe something like a neutral grip in theory isn't great for training chest, if you're someone who's limited in internal rotation or you have pain with internal rotation, neutral grip and letting you at least get into the motion is probably going to be one of your better options if you've got a machine that allows you to still connect in that regard. People that are generally limited in IR2, you've got, people who are very, very narrow like myself, and generally we don't need to be out here anyway. Because is my pec like that's going to be more front out than anything.
Right. You can
People
see
like
it just sitting there.
yourself. Yeah. That's also why I don't do any direct front out work. And people like yourself who are wide and should have IR, but maybe don't. You're going to probably be more okay there, provided you kind of control your depth. So I think just knowing like how can we predict, knowing that training in some way is always going to have some sort of tax. How can we predict that? And that's more important to do with larger superficial muscles because they're going to have a secondary effect on other muscle groups you want to train and just maintaining mobility.
You know, I don't know if you noticed this when we trained together in person, when we trained, when we did chest. I instinctually learned from a young age. I'm gonna try to do this while I'm sitting here, and hopefully everybody can see me. I feel like so many people's posture is here when they're pressing, where I always just want to be there and then getting that. And you can look, I mean, you can see when I move my arms up, like my chest goes without even flexing it. Like, so I learned really quickly that if I'm using a hammer strength, if I'm doing a dumbbell press, like as long as I keep that chest lifted, I'm good. But I'm not like trying to squeeze my scapula together or doing some retraction. Like that feels terrible. Then I'm thinking about everything on my back, like you said, back being tight. And I'm not thinking about, okay, Chris, like how can we get all of this shit to move this way? Right? Because
Yeah, so go back to that position for a second, because this
yeah,
is where, and like take a mental screenshot of that. I guess if you're up on your screen, you can see it. This area right here, you have the ability to lift that.
right.
So
Yeah.
those second through fourth ribs are designed to do that.
Okay.
But in people who are not shaped in a way where that is easy to do and changes airflow and fluid dynamics, it
Right.
gets dropped down. And that's
Oh,
kind of like that divot that like I can't elevate mine. And if I do that, it just comes from my low back.
right.
And that there's again like there's a lot in this.
Right.
But I think ultimately like that's part of why like our morphological types are so important. It's easy for you to get in that position. So it's like, yeah, let's load that sucker up. But someone who can't find that ability to raise those pump handle ribs, it ends up just taking everything on our back and again just shoving that forward again. So a lot of that again, like I'm such a nerd about the rib cage because it just explains so much. It's such a powerful reference to have.
And after many talks with you, I realized like that ability that I have is why my front shots look way different than my back. Like
Yeah.
and I mean, I guess you could call that a gift and a curse all in the same time, right? Like, because that feels natural to me. And what's really funny, like, because you know my wife, like, she always jokes, she's like, Chris, you have some of the best posture of any person. She's like, when I first met you, I thought you were just like walking around like a peacock because you were just like proud of the muscle you had. And I'm like, she's like, then I got to know you, and I was like, no, like, that's just how you stand.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, your system is definitely heavily biased one direction, and it's great for certain things, but um, again, it's kind of a question of like anytime someone is awesome at one thing, you know it's detracting from something else, right?
right. Yeah,
Pretty much anytime.
yes,
So there's always that kind of cost.
yeah.
I'm kind of curious too. So one thing that people I think are starting to talk about now, at least more in the circles that I run in,
Mhm.
um, is how much our body position changes fluid dynamics. I want to come back to the decline for a second.
Okay, yeah, please.
Because it basically, for you to be able to move well in decline, if this is you from the bottom up, and this is the back of your rib cage, and this is the front, it should do this
Okay.
because we have our organs, and that's really heavy. Like that is the heaviest part of ourselves. In a decline, in fluid dynamics, it is going to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
And just having tested you in person and done a little work on you, that's also where you do not expand well at all.
no,
Is that upper rib cage mobility for you is not there. So it's interesting that even on a slight decline, I think some of that's probably just as simple as biomechanics and levers and things like that. But I think a lot of that also comes down to can you even get in position to where your body can accept load and connective tissue can accept load there?
right.
And probably not.
Yeah. Because what's really interesting is for years when I would have a thick chest from the front and from the side, but the moment you make my hands go above my head, all it would look flat, right? I would get zero chest projection in a front no bicep. And my initial thought was, fuck it. I just need to get my chest so thick that no matter where I take my hands, it's going to be there. That's the meathead thought, right? And then it led me to think, okay, maybe I need to stop spending so much time on incline and just dedicate some more time to like lower pec. So then I started doing a lot of like hammer strength decline, dumbbell decline, dips, pec minor dips to try to get that projection off that lower portion of the pec where in a side chest, all that shit sits up near my chin. And I'm like, of course that looks good.
Yeah.
Um, so I
But
began
you
to
get that
tinker with
fullness.
that. And what's really interesting is I thought of it as like a needing of tissue where in the grand scheme of life, like, was it structurally non-biased to go there when I picked up a heavy weight?
Mm-hmm.
So,
And then you get into the idea of training history and fascia lines. And I don't want to get too like I personally, whenever someone talks like, oh, fascia, I'm like, do you even lift? But now as a bodybuilder and one who's come from a powerlifting background and working with a bunch of guys who have that like you've seen Dave, he's got that enormously dense tissue. But there's like it doesn't have that pretty round look that is going to be rewarded on stage, depending on who's judging, right?
yes,
Which
yeah,
which is another component. Pick your judges.
yeah.
Um, but you have to think about. I took a content course, what it was, but it was pretty mind blowing to me. They gave me the exact data on just how much nerve input that white stuff,
Mhm.
connective tissue, really has. And you go into a dissection in a medical school or PT school, you just kind of cut right through it, and you don't even think about it. And we've kind of just tossed it off to the side, but there's so much data from the nervous system standpoint that tells us about development. And we have to remember the nerves ultimately going to tell the muscle which motor units, which muscle fibers need to be used. And so it's really important to kind of think about that. So I wonder for you, just with the training history and training age, um, what it takes to actually open up those units differently. And I'm not even thinking for chest only, I'm also thinking for back is often going to require a lower load because if you go with a heavier load, you're always going to move through what's most efficient.
Correct. Yes.
And if you're trying to access something new and really dial it in there, um, moving slowly is one of the hardest, but also most important things to do.
Great. And you touched on a really interesting topic that I have some like crazy theories about. You said developing that pretty round muscle. Like, so to continue down that training line of history, right? So the first four programs I did with John, it was all pressing like I described, right? And then the next segment after 2 years of pressing was creeping death one, which led into a secondary chest and shoulder pump day. So the first day of the week of chest was all of his basics, right? Some kind of dumbbell press, an incline barbell, some kind of machine press, and some sort of fly. So that was my base day, so to speak. Then we trained shoulders. The pump day was neutral grip pressing, a shitload of dips, and then it usually was like a machine or two of choice, or a dumbbell of choice that was all had some RP in there. So it was like not to
Mhm.
failure. It was just like trying to blow it up as much as possible. So
Yeah.
that to me, I think, began to give my muscle a look that was right. And I kind of found the groove because he let me freelance the pump sessions because he knew I had this to do that.
Right.
So he's like, look at your photos, what feels good, be smart, train it, get a huge pump, get out. So the base day was like, move
Nice.
heavy shit. Day two was, okay, get that tissue from here to here to here to here is blown out front, projected, and side as much as possible, and then off of the rib cage. That to me is what developed my chest to be round, full, and bubbly, but also at the same time maintaining the strength and the integrity it takes to be thick enough through the chest to where it mattered. And I know that that's hard for a lot of intermediate to beginner lifters to understand, but with chest training, I've always felt you have to have a certain level of strength, both men and women, to develop the density of a chest that is impressive.
Completely agree.
And then on the flip side, you have to hit that from all angles and a decent amount of volume, enough to get that thing full and pretty.
I was
Um,
going to ask you next, like, there are two kind of big fillers that I think are important here. I would say rep range and then intensifiers
yes,
because I'm a huge fan of like I freaking love rest pause work for chest.
agreed.
It's probably one of my favorite intensifiers to use. But
I love Russ Paul's. I honestly like supersets, right? So
yeah,
you're out there doing upper chest and a decline in a superset, and you will get so effing full, like it's disgusting feeling, like in a good way. I love incline dumbbell flies into a decline hammer strength. I love an incline barbell press into uh decline dumbbell. You do those two combos that feel great. I love a pec deck, and you go right into machine dips. You talking about blowing your chest up?
hmm,
Just this past Tuesday, I went to failure with the stack on pec deck, immediately go over to my body weight loaded on a dip machine, go to failure, then go back to the pec deck, cut that weight in half, do 5 hard contractions where you're just squeezing the piss out of it, and then sit in the stretch for 30 seconds. I thought everything through here was going to rip.
love it. And I'm picturing you doing that with that like I'm so envious of your ability to just like hit whatever you just did here.
Right, right.
I sit here and I'm like, man, I want to be able to do that, but my rib cage is shaped this way, and it's not good for bodybuilding.
You know what's
Um,
really funny? Early on in my career, I would tell it to people. I'm like, I'd sit down on a bench or a machine, fill in the blank, and I'd be like, just do this. And they're like, we can't do that. I'm like,
yeah. Well, and there's a lot of scapular mechanics that come in that too. Like we could talk about shoulder training from that standpoint of like what position is the scap in? Because if I hit my poses right, my shoulders look big. But if I'm just sitting here, it looks like I've. You're like, Tana, do you have a side delt?
right.
I promise you it's there. I just have to pose just right. And position the arm. So we could talk about that too at some point, like
Yeah.
how to choose, different angles and whatnot.
To wrap this up, let's go over rep range and kind of
Yeah,
set totals.
yeah.
Um, Chest, believe it or not, is one of the muscles that I don't mind going lower. Like, I don't mind a 6 to 8 on an incline barbell, or even a dumbbell, not six, but 8 to 10 on a dumbbell. I don't mind 6 to 8 on a machine, even though I'd probably prefer it a little bit higher. Flies, I like 10 to 15, maybe 20. As a whole, if I'm speaking very general, by the way.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of my rep ranges, like that I tend to like. But at the same time, if you're going to do an incline barbell press with six reps, dear God, control that negative.
Mm-hmm.
Like you
Mm-hmm.
cannot dive bomb it.
Yeah.
which is another great thing about stopping it 2 to 3 inches above your chest or your collarbone, however you view that, is you have to control the negative. Like
Hmm.
there's nothing to bang it off of.
Yeah.
You
I
know,
almost wonder if, for that reason, it'd be better to go with a barbell instead of a Smith because a Smith
right.
doesn't, you don't have to impose so much control on the situation.
True, true. That
Interesting.
I love, listen, I love all types of Smith machine pressing for upper chest. Like for years I used to finish my chest off with bringing a Smith machine down to my chin on a pretty high incline. And that would, like, it felt like
Oh yeah, I'm just visualizing that, and I'm like, yeah,
it's so good. No, listen, I know people are like, oh, Chris, it's a lot of front delt. Yeah, you're damn right. Like, I've always viewed chest, like the front delt as an extension of it, like when I train it, specifically with pressing. Because, like, I feel like all of this ties in. And then I view side and rear delt as a completely different body part. And I know that may be weird to think about for a lot of people, but to me, almost like front delt goes with chest. Like, I don't think about that. I mean, yeah.
I think a better way to think about that is just we're so used to thinking about the muscles like, okay, this is this muscle, but really like this is all tissue. And
Yes.
where do they share attachments? Well, they share a lot of common attachments right in this area.
Correct. Yeah.
So rather than thinking about like chest or delt, I think it's more about like the anatomy of what attaches where and shared attachments. That's how I view it.
Yes.
I think what you just said makes a lot of sense.
Because a lot of times I'll have guys reach out to me, Chris, I feel a lot of pressing in my front delt. And I'm like, okay, cool, show me a video. Because if you're pressing and you're going that, and you're getting like your serratus punch, I think is what some people call that. That's what I call it in my idiot brain, right?
That's what
Like,
people call that.
stop that shit. Like, if you aren't doing that, or pressing with like a concave chest where it's a lot of front delt, then it's not a big deal. Like if I fill my front delt on an incline barbell with 3 plates on it, like bro, I'm good with that. Like it's okay.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Don't freak the fuck out. It's kind of like if like, oh Chris, well on leg press, like I feel my hamstrings a little bit when I'm doing. I'm like, oh, okay. Are your quads burning? Yeah. Okay. We're good.
Oh, we're good. Don't worry about it. It's all right. Well,
Yeah.
I love the way that Dave and I were talking about Scott Stevenson a couple weeks ago. I forget why, but he's got certain exercises that are just like general upper body or like press or like thigh exercise. And I love that because it lets you just get after it and not worry
Right.
so much. You know,
Yes. Yep.
there's a time to like build in and build the pretty stuff, but you got to have the scaffolding laid first. And you only do that by not getting too worried about,
Yes.
yeah.
I think a great example of that is like a dumbbell pullover, right? People are like, what does
Hmm.
that work? I'm like, a lot of upper body shit.
Yeah. Like it depends on how far you can take that. And if you have your pec blocking you, if you have the shoulder rotation actually get overhead.
Yes, right. That's how I always view like dumbbell pullovers is like it's just going to give you a complete look to your upper body. Very similar to where I think most people, if they squatted, that's a lower body exercise. You're going to get some glute, you're going to get some quad, you get some hamstring. Unless you're one of those rare people who are, really good at, knees over toes, or you're really good at like shoving your hips back, like then it might be a little bit more biased. But a squat is lower body. If for chest,
Mhm.
I was saying like I'm not terrified that if when I get off of a heavy incline barbell, if I feel chest, front delt, and a little bit of tricep, I'm not
I
gonna
love it.
freak out.
I
Like,
get pretty excited about
right, right, because
it. Man, like again, like I shouldn't maybe, but to me, spoto pressing is one of the best movements I was ever able to really get my pecs with. But again, that's because range, tension, and just the heavy load. I think pecs are made to handle heavier load. So with rep range, I'm kind of with you, where I think it's good to have a couple movements that are in that 6 to 8 rep range. I generally think most body parts require a little bit of everything. Maybe not, but I do think the pecs do.
yeah. Here's what I learned from powerlifting. When you assess that genre of people who are good at it as a whole, if you look at those guys, it's chest and triceps that are great at pressing, right? Okay, why? When you look at them as a whole, for not speaking about like a push day, most lack side and rear delts, but they have a thick chest and big ass triceps. And I'm like, okay, what can we learn from that? We need to press heavy.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it's as simple as that. And I know these Instagram scientists are going to like, Chris, you have to hyper isolate the chest. And I'm like, Ugh, yeah, no, you have to learn how to fucking press the 150s, not the 50s.
And you
Like,
have to learn how to love to train. How about that?
right. And I
Yeah.
think like that's where the disconnect is, where it's like I look at it as a whole and I'm like, okay, cool. Like, what can I learn from people who are brutally strong?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what muscles do they have? What muscles don't they have? Why are they lacking that? Like if we're staying on that powerlifting topic, for the most part, like if you look at a good powerlifter who's got a good squat, huge ass, minimal to moderate quad. Why?
Yeah.
Sitting back into that bitch. They're getting erectors, glutes, and
Yeah.
hamstrings. Like, okay, so cool. What can we learn from that? If you need glutes, erectors, and hamstrings, how about we start squatting like them?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And if I want quads, I need to probably watch someone like Tom Platz, like
Yeah.
on the block.
Yeah.
Like,
For
I,
sure.
to me, all that is, I really challenge everyone. That's where I want to finish with, right? Is like, be observant and like you can learn something from everyone, good or negative. Like, you don't have to look down on the power lifter and be like, oh God, look how shitty his rear delts are. I'm like, no, like he has a massive chest, front delt, and triceps because he presses heavy. Okay, cool. Like, how about you come look at my page for rear delts? And it's like, how did he get those? Okay, what if we paired that shit together?
Yeah. 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 Just a little mosaic.
Good things happen. Like that's how I learned bodybuilding. I was like, if I just take a little bit from everyone and then make it my own shit, like, huh, it's weird. We're able to develop a complete physique as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to I'm going to listen to one singular person and get one perspective and mindset.
Yeah. 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 No kidding.
What,
No
which is
kidding.
why I think you and I instinctually love talking to people who are smart with this stuff and have experience of in the trenches. It's like, what can I learn from you? Please, God. I mean, you opened my mind so much to like structure, rib cage, alignment, how I'm built, how I move through space that it's like it completely changed and created a different narrative in my brain for instead of those people can't do this, it's they can't do it because of a very different reason. Not because they don't, not because they lack the will. It's because we have to find another route to get that muscle to develop.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, that's all things chest. I
Mhm.
hope we answered your guys' questions. If
And if you
not,
have more, please drop them below. We like the
yeah,
interaction.
post them below. We can do this for every body part. We can go into certain dynamics of, hey, like, one of my best YouTube videos is I just walked everyone through how to train chest if their shoulders were beat to shit. And I know that may sound like, oh, Chris, no shit, like get off the flat bench, but you'd be surprised how many people come in the gym and they're like, oh God, my shoulder. And then what do? They go flat bench. Well,
Yeah.
there's
Yep.
some other ways, homie.
Yeah. There are, you are literally one solution away from not hurting.
Yeah. Look, like, listen, you need to put that on a shirt.
Yeah. No kidding. One solution. I am going to put that on a shirt.
Do
I'm
it.
going to
That
do
needs to be like your motto, or what is that mission statement, maybe?
one solution away. I love it. Write that down.
Yeah, please do. All right, guys, girls, until next time, Chris, Dr. Danny, we are done.